those of you to whom Greek is Greek, please use the headphones. I'm Panagiotis Oilos. I'm the Joseph Ferris Professor of Greek Studies and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard and the President of the European Cultural Center of Delphi. Έχοντας ως βάση ένα από τα πιο εμβληματικά τοπόσημα του αρχαίου κόσμου, την έδρα του μαντίου του Απόλλωνα, τους Δελφούς, οι δελφικοί διάλογοι έχουν σκοπό να συμβάλλουν στη διερεύνηση, την κατά το δυνατόν διάγνωση και διάβγαση σημαντικών θεμάτων τα οποία απασχολούν ήδη και πρόκειται να συνεχίσουν να απασχολούν την ανθρωπότητα στο άμεσο διαφαινόμενο και στο μέτρο του δυνατού προβλέψιμο μέλλον. Θα ήθελα να τονίσω εδώ ότι ποτέ πριν στην πρόσφατη ιστορία του κέντρου η ελληνική πολιτεία δεν αναγνώρισε και υποστήριξε εμπράκτως τον διεθνή πολιτιστικό προσανατολισμό και σημασία του κέντρου τόσο αποφασιστικά όσο τα τελευταία χρόνια με προεξάρχοντες την Υπουργό Πολιτισμού Δ. Αλίνα Μενδώνη αλλά και τον ίδιο τον Πρωθυπουργό κ. Κυριάκο Μητσοτάκη. Χαρακτηριστικά, ας αναφέρω ότι μέχρι την άνοιξη του 2006, χάρη στην πρωτοβουλία και ακάματη φροντίδα της Υπουργού Πολιτισμού Λίνας Μενδώνη, το συνεδριακό μας κέντρο θα είναι πλήρως ανακαινισμένο και ενεργειακά αναβαθμισμένο. Πριν 1,5 χρόνο περίπου υπογράψαμε την προγραμματική σύμβαση μεταξύ του κέντρου και του
Ago, we signed a contract, an agreement actually for the realization of this major project worth approximately 11 million euro, which has been included in the financing of the recovery fund. The works are currently in progress, but the ECCD, as you see, remains fully active during these refurbishment works. Let me say that the region of Sterea Hellas, with his personal care and initiative of Mr. Fanis Panos, will include the refurbishment of the hostel in the program worth, and this is a project worth almost 1 million. So the third Delphi dialogues are focused on a highly sophisticated and very interesting issue of bioethics, biopolitics and democracy. The dramatic technological developments that are taking place at a very fast pace, unprecedented pace, change the very hypostasis and ontology of human beings. The third Delphi dialogue is a complement, the thematic of the two first Delphi dialogues that investigated the ways in which technology and artificial intelligence influences and reshapes the democratic institutions as well as individual rights, or redefines the ontology of human beings on the threshold of the post-human era. It's worth stressing that all in all, so far, the first and second Delphi dialogues have been watched on the web by at least 300,000 people around the world. This is a unique success for such an institution and not only for the Greek reality. The unprecedented developments in various scientific disciplines, most prominently in medicine, biomedicine, genetics, the IT, computer science and physics, as well as technology, including AI, gave the political and economic centers of power highly sophisticated apparatuses and tools of biopolitics in order to manage, regulate, and supervise and formulate, or form rather, major aspects of citizens' lives. The Delphi dialogues will explore a number of complex questions arising from this new reality, including the ones: how are bioethical principles and priorities redefined as a result of the aforementioned developments, especially in the area of genetics and biomedicine and medicine? To what extent and how could a balance be struck between the concentration of scientific and technological capital in a few research and entrepreneurial organizations on the one hand, and the protection and expansion of democratic ideals and civil rights on the other hand? in what way, or what are the threats that the highly sophisticated and complex as well as elaborate biopolitical apparatuses entail for democratic institutions. The third Delphi dialogues are under the auspices of the President of the Hellenic Republic, Konstantinos Tasoulas, who some months ago said about the ECCD. And I'm quoting, in a manner of speaking, the events in this inspired venue refute in a very fruitful manner the last heartbreaking oracle to Julian the Apostate, which went, "Tell the king that Phoebus no longer has a home, nor the speaking spring, and the voice of the water has been silenced." Now, there is no speaking spring. Well, that was the last oracle that after 10 centuries of operation has been characterized as the mournful bell sound that signified the end of a world. Since 1977, on another more rational basis, the spring speaks again, is speaking again, thanks to the operation of the European Cultural Center of Delphi, a lighthouse of culture and a bridge between the past and the present of the Greece and the world. The DAO Global Thanks to Technology institution of the Delphi Dialogues could not have taken place without the boundless generosity of Eurolife, FSH as well, and I personally as well, all the people of our center are profoundly grateful to Eurolife and its management board, and of course its unwearied and inspired CEO of Eurolife, Mr. Sargeorgiou, a friend of Delphi. The speakers of the third Delphi Dialogues are excellent and prominent colleagues and belong to the most influential scholars globally in the area of reflection on biopolitics, bioethics, culture, democracy, as well as the ongoing presence of ancient Greek thought in the modern world, contemporary world. All of them are pioneers in their realms and approach them from their own complementary perspectives. Their work is at the spearhead globally in the research areas that they represent. The names of the colleagues, speakers, in the order that they will speak: Daniel Wickler, Frederick Kirk, Ellen Scarry, Michael Hart, Dimitrios Yatomandlakis, James Faubion, Didier Fassin, Timothy Charles Campbell. The papers and discussions of all Delphi Dialogue will be published in a special volume, most probably next spring. I would like at this point to also announce a new international initiative that I call the New Delphic Oracle Project, the Future of Humanity. Since, as of 2026, an international committee made up of prominent scholars and scientists, genetics, astronomers, etc., will be coming to Delphi to announce the findings of their groundbreaking research and discuss how these developments will shape the immediate future of the foreseeable future of humanity. A very prominent committee is being shaped currently. I would like to warmly thank my prominent colleague, professor of philosophy at the University of Paris-Nanterre, Patrice Manlier, who's teaching this year at the Delphi Academy of European Studies. Yet another vision of mine that came true 8 years ago, thanks to the support of the region of Sterea Hellas and the governors of the region, the previous one and the current one. I thank Patrice, who accepted chairing tomorrow's session, as well as the colleague speakers, James Faubion and Elaine Scarry, who will also chair sessions, some sessions. And let me also note that we also have together the Delphi Academy, the professors and students from around the world who attend the Delphi Academy European Studies, most of the students being postgraduate students as well as PhD candidates. I'd also like to mention that we also have together the inspired CEO of Eurolife, Mr. Alexandros Georgiou, who will address this conference as well. The member of the board, Angelos Androulakis, the former ambassador of Chile to Greece, the ambassador emeritus, Mr. Alexandros Minarakis for CAS, and as well as the ambassador emeritus, Mr. Anastasios Kyriakoukis, who honors and helps assists our center free of any charge as advisor to the Center on International and Public Relations. Finally, I'd like to also thank all the people of the European Cultural Center of Delphi who worked so fervently for the implementation of the Delphi Dialogue. First of all, the director, Professor Andreas Kofas, who tirelessly works for this event to come true. And of course, he also cared for the technologically developed promotion of the Delphi Dialogue, Mrs. Athina Gotsi, Mrs. Spatula, Mr. Spatulas, excuse me, Mrs. Eleni Tsureli, Ms. F. Vasolopoulou, Mr. Aris Gouvelis, all the people of the center. I would also like to thank Mrs. Katerina Liberopoulou, an excellent journalist, reporter, and advisor to the Center of Delphi. Thank you very much. I hope that, like myself, you and everyone who's watching us around the world online, and those who are going to attend the Delphi Dialogue will learn a lot. Now, I kindly ask Mr. Alexandros Georgiou to take the floor and share a few thoughts with us.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Guests from all over the world, and thank you for being here. Also on behalf of Eurolife, I think you raise the level of this to a level that is world class. So thank you very much. Allow me to switch to Greek. Kalispera σας.
Good afternoon. You know, I was thinking, as my dear friend Panagiotis Roilos, a friend of mine, how lucky I am that by knowing him, a company like ours, one of the largest insurance companies in Greece, has the opportunity to assist the work of the European Cultural Delphi Center of Delphi, under the leadership of Panagiotis Roilos, Professor Panagiotis Roilos, on issues that might sound very elaborate and sophisticated, but in essence are issues that touch upon our daily lives and will touch upon our daily lives in many significant ways. Eurolife FFH believes, and the Fairfax group to which we belong, believe that we've got the duty to return part which mostly focuses on regions in areas like culture, demographics, and low birth rate. But when Professor Roilos talked to me about the European Cultural Center of Delphi, not only was I very pleased to understand the type of work that is done here, but I was also pleased because it is not so trendy in your corporate social responsibility to support efforts that are at assisting thinkers or intellectuals and scholars, especially of your caliber and level. And thanks to Professor Roylos, this is now, we have been given the opportunity, and not only us, but the world, the entire world online. I believe that this is going to be a very fruitful and prominent event. Thank you very much. Conference, rather. Thank you very much.
Sorry. I'll try that again. Very pleased to be the moderator of this first session of our dialogues and to introduce two very distinguished speakers who have graced us with attending. I will first introduce our inaugural speaker, Daniel Wickler, who is Mary B. Saltonstall Professor of Ethics and Population Health Emeritus in the Department of Global Health and Population at Harvard University. His title aptly points to the specialties that have defined a most distinguished career, which has included service as the first staff ethicist for the World Health Organization and staff philosopher for the US President's Commission, I think not the current President's Commission. Carter, okay. For the study of ethical problems in medicine and biomedical and behavioral research. He is also the co-founder and second president of the International Association of Bioethics. His publications are too many to list, but let me mention that they include From Chance to Choice, Genetics and Justice, and Measuring the Global Burden of Disease, Philosophical Dimensions. Professor Wickler will speak to us this evening on bioethics in an era of disinformation. Please welcome him.
How do I advance slides? I've got a few.
I don't.
We have a question.
A slide program?
Well, I can come up there.
You're it, sir.
Good. Thank you. Professor Roylos, Professor Gofas, all who are have given us this opportunity at the Delphi Dialogues to join in discussion together on matters of global significance. What an honor it is to receive an invitation from this cradle of democracy, a democracy which is now under siege in my country, which is so precious to us all. We do everything we can to try to preserve it, and we welcome any wisdom that you can give to us in that pursuit. So I will speak on bioethics in an era of disinformation. And let me say that bioethics, which is my field, has not really engaged the question of disinformation. It just came at us so suddenly. It came as if from nowhere. Suddenly we were faced with an onrush of lies, of untruths. What do you do in that situation? None of my colleagues really have had great wisdom on what to do about this. We have to figure something out. So I'm a professional bioethicist, and by that I mean that I attempt to identify and resolve ethical dilemmas and problems arising in respect to health and healthcare through evidence and moral reasoning. In this use of the term, bioethics is an activity, not any set of particular positions on issues or even principles. My fellow bioethicists and I disagree among ourselves on nearly everything. That's how I'll be using the term today. My specialization, by the way, is what has been called population-level bioethics, bioethical issues arising at the population level. I'm happy to clarify what that means during the discussion if anyone's interested. I teach courses on this at Harvard School of Public Health. It's easier to define the word disinformation. It's the propagation of claims of fact with a deliberate attempt to mislead. This is to be contrasted with misinformation, which involves claims of fact that may reflect sincere but inaccurate beliefs by its source. But this difference is not nuanced enough. Disinformers can, and often do, proceed by propagating the messages of misinformers, that is, people who believe in what they're saying. And there are degrees of sincerity in much of this misinformation, often difficult to gauge. It's rumored that Robert Kennedy Jr. vaccinated his children. What does he think about the efficacy of vaccines? In any case, I'll use the term disinformation in what follows without pausing each time to distinguish carefully between these shades of meaning. This won't be ideal, but I'll try to avoid distortion. This is indeed an era of disinformation in health and in much else. It pours in constantly. Social media, in which gatekeepers are a diminishing source of protection against falsehoods, are its natural home. But it seeps upward into popular culture, into the less discriminating or more agenda-driven news media, and most worrisome of all, in what we hear from governments and even health authorities. Disinformation isn't new, of course. Over 300,000 South Africans died because its leaders rejected science in favor of falsehoods they are said to have found on the internet while, quote, doing their own research, unquote. Long before that, any number of quack cures were promoted on the basis of wildly false claims of efficacy and safety, often, of course, propagated by those hoping to profit from those sales. It was in the COVID pandemic that health disinformation reached flood tide. Claims that downplayed its risk, promoted useless remedies, made preposterous claims about the risks of vaccines, and attributed dark ulterior motive for standard non-pharmaceutical public health measures. Ominously, anti-science aligned with partisan political aims, particularly on the far right, and in the United States and other countries eventually merged with them. Bioethics, in the sense in which I'm using the term here as the use of moral reasoning to identify and resolve ethical dilemmas relating to health, is nearly impossible when we are saturated with disinformation. Reason has nothing to do with the disputes that arise. Disinformation serves up untruths, and those who believe them think themselves to be in a world quite different from the world that we actually inhabit. Typically, bioethical dilemmas take certain facts as a starting point and require us to draw out their implications and confront the difficult choices that these may entail. In an era of disinformation, the disagreements are about those starting points. Bioethics can't even begin. During the COVID period, our group at Harvard suspended the customary agenda of our ethics classes and focused more narrowly on ethical dilemmas in the then current emergency. These were questions of liberty versus the collective good, of the conflicts between the goal of saving as many lives as possible and giving as many people a chance to survive, deciding who should be vaccinated first, and many more. Our students did original thinking and research, For a while, our seminar used the internet to hold sessions together with a similar seminar meeting at the time in China. Some of our graduate students co-authored their term papers with their Chinese counterparts. But we could not ignore the flood of disinformation. So, for 3 years, we took the unusual step of inviting the disinformers to join the class. More precisely, misinformers. I'd like to tell you a bit about what happened. The people I'll be talking about in this section of the paper are normal, well-meaning, intelligent fellow citizens. I thought that they would be the easy cases to set straight. We deal with the malicious agents later. Well, they turned out to be a very tough nut to crack, as you'll see. Through a friend who had been in the Minnesota state legislature, I learned that Democrats and Republicans were sharply divided on COVID questions. This, of course, fit the national pattern. But Minnesota is famous within the United States for its civility, called Minnesota nice. Traffic proceeds slowly in intersections because each driver urges the others to make their turn first, inducing stalemate. Even politicians strive to maintain good relationships across party lines. COVID was putting this under strain. So leaders of the two parties jointly proposed hiring a boat for a weekend cruise through the state's innumerable waterways to restore good feeling. Planning proceeded smoothly until one of the Democrats said that no one should be allowed on board if they remained unvaccinated. The plan collapsed. Through my friend, I extended invitations to the opposing leaders to Zoom into our class and explain the reason for their positions. Of particular interest to us at the School of Public Health was what the Republican would say. She explained that she had heard that experts disagreed on many of the basic facts, and that this required her as a non-expert to, quote, do her own research, unquote, conducted, of course, on the internet. What she found made her hesitant to be vaccinated, and she was appalled that she would be forbidden to join the cruise because she had made this very personal decision. I'm pleased to report that she expressed great satisfaction with her decision to participate in our course. It was the only occasion, she said, in which people seemed genuinely interested in her reasons for her views. Usually, as soon as I question the vaccine, she said, people just start calling me names. She may not quite have understood that our class's interest in her reasoning was mainly to understand where she went wrong, and I didn't try to correct her misimpression. Her account was indeed enlightening. It repeated a theme that's become familiar from the study of other mass disinformation efforts conducted, among others, by my Harvard colleague, Naomi Oreskes. And here we see, here we see two books, excellent books, on how this procedure, which has been perfected by many, how this usually proceeds. These scholars found that industries such as tobacco and fossil fuels have strenuously attempted to preserve a market for their products by planting doubts among members of the public that scientists had proven that these products were dangerous. They ensured that their sponsorship of these efforts would be hidden, and they employed any number of leading scientists to confuse the public by questioning the risks. In some cases by publishing outright lies, but more often by selective publication, so-called cherry picking, of elements in the scientific data that could be countered only by those expert in the literature. COVID seemed to fit this pattern, as the Republican Minnesotans' own doubts suggest, but this posed a big puzzle. We knew who would be motivated to instill doubt that smoking causes cancer, that lead is safe, and that climate change is either not occurring or is not the result of burning fossil fuels. Huge profits are at stake. But apart from sellers of quack cures who could be profiting by misleading the public about COVID? The answer wasn't apparent for a while, and when it emerged, it wasn't pretty. For the second and third years, I invited a different guest. This man, a friend of mine from college days, is a businessman, not a scientist, and a former Trump campaign official. He reads avidly with particular interest in science. As a general rule, if he believes something, I do not, and vice versa. He is convinced that AIDS is unrelated to HIV, that climate change is a hoax, that COVID vaccines have killed far more people than COVID has, and so on. He's an intelligent person and not evidently crazy. I've long been mystified by what I see as his penchant for error. We once decided that we would, over the course of an entire year, try to convince the other of our views about climate change. This entailed countless detailed email exchanges, replete with citations to the literature. Neither of us changed our position in any way. My friend attributed my acceptance of orthodox views on these questions to a personality trait of giving excessive respect to those of high rank. Of course, I rejected this. I think of myself as more likely to question authority than to submit to it. I pointed to instances in which the experts have been proven completely wrong, such as the thesis of continental drift. And I pointed out that on at least 2 questions of importance in my field, I hold views that contradict the evident consensus of most experts, although not all experts. Nevertheless, I stick to my position. They are, if you're curious, the definition of death and the question of harm reduction and tobacco control. Naomi Oreskes, my Harvard colleague, addressed my friend's concerns in a paper entitled "The Scientific Consensus on Climate Change: How Do We Know That We're Not Wrong?" It's an engaging and thoughtful paper that fully acknowledges that experts have been wrong in the past, and of course, that they did not know that at the time. She admits that it's possible that the experts are wrong this time, but she argues very persuasively that we have no reason to believe that this is the case. I commended it to my friend without any noticeable effect. My friend was surprised but pleased by my invitation to join the class. He said that I was showing my merit as a professor by enabling my students to be exposed to views that were at odds with orthodoxy, and he looked forward to presenting his case. We agreed that he would assign 2 or 3 fairly brief articles as required reading, and that he would be the sole guest in a full 90-minute class, opening with a statement of about 15 minutes, and then responding to questions and challenges from students. What I didn't tell my friend was that along with the articles that he sent, I also asked the students to read debunking, fact-checking rebuttals of these same papers that I found on websites maintained by scientists for this purpose. These were easy to find because the authors of the articles that my friend sent were notorious. One was the son of a famous politician, Robert F. Kennedy. It was widely held that had he not borne his renowned father's name, he would be merely one of a sea of anti-science fringe figures clamoring for attention. The prominence that his name provided ensured that debunking scientists would make a special point of refuting his claims. These long class discussions with my friend were rather fascinating, but to me also dispiriting. To my surprise and also my disappointment, he emerged unscathed, which helps to explain why he agreed to recur a second time. His opening statement was artful. He emphasized that he was not a scientist, no kind of expert, but he was a citizen. And in that role, he felt a civic obligation to try to stay current on issues of public concern, including developments in science. His model for the dutiful citizen was that of a jury, in a case in which both sides are offered expert witnesses who, though each of them are expert, disagree sharply. The jury listens to experts called by one side and then those called by the other. They weigh the evidence as they understand it, and finally they reach their conclusions. So too, my friend told the class, on topics such as COVID vaccines, I seek out reporting and scientists' writings on all sides of the issues. And though their authors are expert, and I am not, it's up to me to decide which ones to believe. Sometimes I'll go wrong, he said. And he told the students that if they find him in error, he will thank them for enlightening him. With that, he invited questions. I didn't mention my law school colleagues told me that actual juries are notorious for drawing wildly wrong conclusions about the expert testimony that's provided to them. The students tended to ask for clarification rather than to challenge him. Perhaps they were being polite. On occasion, my friend responded to a challenge by withdrawing a point and thanking the student. A friendly tone prevailed throughout. That was pleasant, but it wasn't the kind of training that I'd hoped for. I was trying to equip the students with the ability through actual practice of dealing with disinformation head on. For the second year, I was more emphatic that the students should not give my friend an easy time, that they should do their best to try to show him that his views were not merely mistaken in one detail or another, but that they were systematically invalid by his misreading of science. But nothing like that happened. Reflecting on these sessions, I had to acknowledge that I was being high-handed and presumptuous. After all, I'm not a scientist either. My degree is in philosophy. So who was I to be so sure that I was the one who was correct in choosing which experts to believe? How would I know? To pursue these questions, we can draw on a substantial philosophical literature. The issue is sometimes called epistemic deference. If I disagree with someone who I acknowledge to be more expert than I, especially if I don't claim any expertise at all, how can it be reasonable for me to maintain my disagreement? Shouldn't I just fall in line? Plato took up this question in the Socratic dialogue called the Charmides, in which Socrates asked if a person, quote, is able to distinguish neither the man who pretends to be a doctor but is none from the man who really is one, nor from any other man who has knowledge from him who has none. These questions are today debated within so-called social epistemology, with many illuminating contributions by philosophers and decision scientists. But let us not dwell too long on these philosophical questions. Granted, my understanding of the science of COVID is shallow, and no doubt I'm completely wrong about many things. Indeed, I often discovered this for myself. But we shouldn't be overly modest about our grasp of reality in the face of so much of this disinformation that is flooding us. In place of an argument to this effect, I just ask you to look at the following graphs that were prepared by the Wall Street Journal, and I choose that source because it is trusted by the right wing. Very simply, these are graphs showing the deaths per 100,000 Americans before and after vaccines came into use. Lots of disease, polio in this case. The vaccines come, and then it fades out. And here's measles, decade after decade, rubella. Still think the vaccines are dangerous? Well, they may have some risks. Now, I'll just use that as an argument stopper. If you'd like to debate whether or not these really prove anything, we can do that in discussion. I won't try to offer a diagnosis of my friend's errors. When he asked me at the end of our year of failed persuasion on climate change how I accounted for our persisting differences, I replied that either I was wrong, or he was stupid, or he was crazy, and that none of these seem likely to me. Perhaps you can offer enlightenment in the discussion period. In any case, I didn't regret inviting the misinformers into my bioethics classroom. I saw no alternatives. What happened next, however, was a development that I hadn't dreamed of. The very disinformer who seems like such a cartoonish character in those classes, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., became the United States chief health official. My friend's outlandish views were now the official positions of the United States government. They are what our government says is true. This was the culmination of developments that had been accelerating in recent years. Anti-vaccine and anti-science activity, which at one time had no particular coloration, became increasingly concentrated on the far right. This became something of an alliance, and then an article of faith, until these essentially merged. Today, the Republican Party is the anti-science party, at least in these key health domains, and they're in control of all branches of the United States government. What the disinformers were seeking, of course, to answer the puzzle that I brought up earlier, but who was going to gain from misinformation or disinformation about COVID, was not profit for a particular product, it was power, and now they have it. This alliance of health disinformation and the far-right politics of the United States is, of course, reflective of comparable developments worldwide, perhaps reflective of the hopes of populists to win public support by encouraging resentment of elites bent on following standard public health pandemic rulebooks, among other once unquestioned practices. This is proving to be a combustible mixture. In the United States, health policy informed by disinformation has resulted in freezing and canceling many hundred research grants and projects. Participants in clinical trials are suddenly told that the experiment is over, even though no conclusions can be drawn. Preservation of laboratory samples is unfunded. Careers in health and biomedical science are turning into tickets for unemployment, losing their appeal to bright young minds. Citizens of other countries are no longer offered access to training in the United States. Government scientists are being told that they may no longer publish in leading medical and scientific journals. New journals under the editorial control of the disinformers will be established to publish their work. Right-wing indifference to the health needs of the world's poorest has led to the abolition of the principal U.S. aid agency and to cancellation of countless research and service delivery grants that offer protection from premature death. The effects are difficult to measure, but one such attempt, the so-called impact counter, reports 103 deaths per hour occurring every hour, 24 hours a day, with a huge accumulated devastating effect on global health. Meanwhile, the infrastructure that might reverse these losses in the event of a change of policy or government is quickly being undermined. The World Health Organization is in a severe budgetary crisis. Other countries are sadly emulating the United States and pulling back from overseas aid just when it is most acutely needed. Even Minnesota NICE is at risk. As some of you may know, a right-wing assailant has been charged with the assassination of one state Democratic leader and the attempted murder of another. It's a new era. Let's see, how much time do we have? I'm out, okay. I'm just, I'll summarize the rest into 1 second. I had actually hoped originally to give you a very different speech about a marvelous new proposal, this one, a proposal by a distinguished group of global health scientists, including my bioethics colleague, Ulla Norheim from Harvard, that the world should embark on an attempt to reduce premature death in half by the year of 2050, and the slogan for this is 50 by 50. It was proposed as a suitable goal for the centenary of the World Health Organization. Now, this wasn't just pie in the sky because there's a wonderful story behind it. The world has actually become a healthier and healthier place for millions and millions of people, for billions of people. Long-standing disparities in life expectancy and health while alive that were gaps impossible to overcome, or seen that way originally, have been narrowing at an amazing clip. And now the people behind this proposal have been able to show that in a number of countries, this halving of premature death has actually occurred. And they laid out graphs and charts and pathways showing how we could try to make this happen in every single country on Earth. Which is to say, if they were bold enough to propose this, we are on the verge of a golden era in global health. Not that there aren't terrible global health problems, but that we're making incredibly rapid progress toward resolving them. But that was 2024. And now we're in 2025, and you can see this world receding at warp speed, to borrow a phrase. And I'm afraid that's the message that I have to end on. Thank you.
the Collège de France, and the School of Higher Studies in the Social Sciences. He is trained in both philosophy and anthropology. He served as director of the research department at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris between 2014 and 2018, and he shares with Professor Wickler having too many publications to list. But I do want to mention his two monographs. The first, Avian Reservoirs, Virus Hunters and Bird Watchers in Chinese Sentinel Post. And the second, which has just been published, yes? Congratulations. Solidarity Between Species, Living with Animals Exposed to Pandemic Viruses. Dr. Keck will be speaking to us this evening on the democratic potential of synergetic power, lessons of wisdom from virus hunters. Thank you.
I wish to thank the organizers for their invitation to this prestigious event. So in 1996, the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss published in the Italian newspaper La Repubblica an article entitled La mucca è pazza e un po' cannibale. The cow is mad and A Little Cannibal, which was republished in French in the journal Études Rurales under the title La leçon de sagesse des vaches folles, The Lessons of Wisdom from Mad Cows. This article was published after the British government revealed new forms of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans connected to cases of bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cows. Such cases of neurodegenerative diseases in humans and cows were linked to the transmission of prion, a protein that turns the brain into a sponge, by the consumption of beef. Claude Lévi-Strauss had followed the researches on this pathogen discovered by Stanley Prusiner in San Francisco in 1981 for scrapie, hence its scientific name, PRPSC, after the researches conducted by Carlton Gajdusek on what he called a slow virus in Papua New Guinea. Gajdusek had successfully transmitted tissues from humans infected with kuru, a neurodegenerative disease transmitted among the foray by the family consumption of dead humans, to monkeys in a laboratory in Bethesda. Lévi-Strauss relied on the researches of virus hunters in cannibalistic societies to shed light on the European debate about mad cow disease through his own ethnographic experience among cannibalistic societies in Brazil. This European debate focused on the comment of the fact that cows had been transformed into cannibals by the consumption of animal foodstuff, a practice that had been routinized in Europe since the beginning of the 20th century, but whose risk for human health was increased in Britain by the intensification of animal breeding and the decrease of the warming temperature of animal foodstuff. The term cannibal cows was particularly used after the European Commission imposed a ban on British meat and recommended killing herds where a suspicious case was found. This term suggested that nature revenged itself for the perversion of the industrial system, which had transformed domesticated animals into monsters, and that humans could only respond to this revenge by massive slaughter of animals. Some philosophers and anthropologists commented on these killings, arguing that they were sacrifices, and noticing that cows were sacrificed not to eat them, as in ancient Greece, but to clean the industrial system of its scapegoats, following the mechanisms of destruction described by René Girard in his reading of Greek tragedies. However, Lévi-Strauss argued that European societies should treat their cows just as the so-called cannibalistic societies of Amazonia treat the animals of the forest. They would release them back into the wild, where they would be hunted, and they would keep some of them as domestic partners and as agents for, I quote, monitoring energy sources and machines. In this technological utopia, which Lévi-Strauss took from Auguste Comte, the founder of French sociology, cannibal cows would occupy an intermediate position between the human societies and the animals returned to the wild. Historians Pierre Vidal-Naquet and Alain Schnapp have described hunting techniques in ancient Greece following structuralist models of the organization of the city. According to them, the space of power where Greek citizens spoke in public, the agora, was built in contrast to a wilderness, silva, where young men had to return to confront their animal condition. In Sparta, hunting served as a preparation for military life, this is a quote, introducing a tension between the collective order of the phalanx that it heralds and the disorder of individual feats that it magnifies. In the tragedies of Aeschylus and Euripides, I quote, the function of the hunt is both complementary to and opposed to that of sacrifice. The hunter is both the predatory animal and the possessor of an art, techne, characterized by cunning, metis, that is the ability to perceive the movements of living beings at the heart of wild spaces. In the writings of Herodotus, the Greeks are confronted with a dual figure of hunting, that of the Scythians and Amazons who cunningly conceal themselves, and that of the kings of Persia who accumulate game. Hence the ambiguity of king hunters like Ulysses, goddess hunters like Artemis, or heroes hunters like Hercules when they serve as model for the initiation of the citizen. While hunting is a predatory activity based on the selection of the prey, Following Vidal-Naquet and Schnapp, it is also an apprenticeship of desire. The hunter must trick his prey to reverse the balance of power in his favor. And this is a practice for men, obviously. Lévi-Strauss, Vidal-Naquet, and Schnapp thus raised a fundamental question for contemporary biopolitics. If our modes of government are based on techniques by which hunters anticipate the transformation of living beings and accumulate game, how can these modes of government be made more democratic? I have raised this discussion starting from an anthropology in Amazonia and Melanesia, and from the history of ancient Greek societies, because these three primitive social forms have long been used in the European debate about what democracy can mean in modern societies. In this talk, I want to analyze how the democratic potential of various hunters can transform our views of biopolitics. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the concept of biopolitics, transformed by Michel Foucault in 1976, has been used in the European debate to criticize measures of government that restrict individual freedom in the name of public health. But little attention has been paid to the fact that these measures followed the recommendation of experts who call themselves virus hunters because they follow the mutations of pathogens across animal species to anticipate a potential pandemic. Michel Foucault has traced the genealogy of biopolitics, which he defined as a power to make, live, and let die, by counting the beings in a population to maximize its health, to what he called pastoral power. In a conference he gave at Stanford University in 1979, entitled Omnes and Singulatim, towards a criticism of political reason, he describes pastoral power as a set of techniques by which a shepherd watches over a herd and sacrifices weak sheep or self-sacrifices, sacrifices himself, to preserve the health of the herd. This concept is illuminating to follow the discussions among epidemiologists about herd immunity during the COVID-19 pandemic, as we just saw in the previous talk, but it doesn't say a lot about the efforts of virologists to track new mutants of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that would jeopardize the vaccination efforts. To describe the attention of virus hunters to the metamorphosis of viruses coming from animals, I have used the term synergetic power, and this is Greek. This is the term for hunting, coming from dogs, which was coined by the French philosopher Grégoire Chamaillou. Chamaillou noticed that parallel to the long genealogy of pastoral power in Judeo-Christian texts, there is a discussion of the power to hunt living beings and accumulate game. That goes back to the figure of King Nimrod in the Bible. Whereas Abraham crosses spaces to care for his people like a flock, Chamaillou says that Nimrod accumulates slaves in a territory to build his people. What makes synergetic power particularly dangerous, by contrast with pastoral power, is that the hunter is not above his prey as the shepherd is above his flock. He is on the same level as his prey, and he can be killed by his prey. By contrast with the benevolence of the shepherd, the hunter is attentive to the traces of the prey on the territory because he wants to catch his prey, but also because he fears becoming the prey. The whole history of synergetic power thus appears as an effort by king hunters to avoid coming face to face with their prey by delegating their prerogatives and multiplying intermediaries through a series of heterogeneous alliances with pastoral authorities. Thus, according to Chamaillou, the Inquisition trials can be understood as devices that enable Catholic kings to avoid coming into contact with the bodies of witches and the rule knowledge they carried. Similarly, when the Spanish conquerors used dogs to hunt Indians, it was not to integrate them into the social body like slaves, but to slaughter them like sick animals, thus basing incipient imperialism on the massacre of indigenous people. So as you see on this slide, this is a very powerful sculpture of a dog hunting a slave that is conserved in the museum around Lille in the north of France. And the other picture is the image of cattle plague, which was a devastating animal disease in Europe in the 18th century that Foucault takes as an example of how biopolitics was modeled on the control of animal diseases, but of course animal diseases that are not transmitted to humans, and hence my diagnostic of zoonosis is that when diseases are transmitted from animals to humans, then humans can take the perspective of the animals on the viruses that are transmitted by the animals. Chamaillou thus shows the subversive potential of synergetic power, but not its democratic potential. He describes how living beings have become what he calls an ungovernable population in neoliberal regimes, when the distance between the prey and the predator has become so long that the prey cannot kill the hunter, but only revolt itself through outbreaks of violence. And he has a particularly interesting book on the drone as this extension of the limit between the hunter and the prey. By contrast, I have used this concept in a different way to follow how virus hunters take the perspective of animals when they anticipate pandemic mutations. I have thus introduced in Foucault's genealogy of biopolitics 2 intellectual lines that have developed in anthropology in the last 40 years. On the one hand, I use the work of Bruno Latour and Paul Rabinow to analyze how scientists connect different actors to mitigate threats. On the other hand, I refer to the works of Philippe Descola and Eduardo Vivas de Castro, showing how hunters take the perspective of the prey through shamanic rituals to anticipate the outcome of the hunt. This connection is linked to the fact that Foucauldian genealogy is more attentive to the transformations of power and often elusive on its form of resistance, whereas social and cultural anthropology is more attentive to the invention and diffusion of techniques of power in collective forms of action. So I claim that synergetic power can be described as democratic when its techniques to hunt living beings are not used in the margins of public spaces, as in the colonial genealogy traced by Chamaillou, but in its center, as in Amazonian societies, or as in ancient Greek societies, where shamanic rituals are staged in the middle of the village, or in contemporary societies where virologists come to the media to explain the mutations of pandemic viruses. For the last 20 years, I have worked with virologists in Hong Kong University who have followed the mutations of influenza viruses since the 1970s. They collected samples from birds and pigs in South China and sent them as viral sequences to the World Health Organization to prepare for the next influenza pandemic, which in their view would come from China. We now know that the probability for an influenza pandemic to start in the United States is higher than in China, as we have seen during the 2009 H1N1 swine flu pandemic, and as we can see with the current spread of the H5N1 avian flu virus in American poultry farm. And we must remember that the 1918 H1N1 influenza virus started from the United States, even if it was called Spanish flu. But for the Australian virologists who built this sentinel post at the Hong Kong University, China was the real threat, because it combined with the accelerating rates of the modernization policy such exotic practices as ducks used in rice paddies to kill pests, chicken raised with pigs in open-air backyards, or poultry killed in wet markets in front of consumers who want to check how fresh they are. Hunting bird viruses was clearly for these Australian virologists a way to continue colonial practices of hunting for birds to transform them into samples sent to European museums where they confirm evolutionary models of natural history. These colonial practices were radically altered in 1997 when Hong Kong was handed over to Chinese sovereignty and when the H5N1 virus appeared on the Hong Kong territory, killing 2/3 of the persons it infected. And the level of lethality of H5N1 is still very constant, despite the fact that it has only infected around 900 persons in the world. The virologists who followed the mutations of this virus in wild birds and domestic poultry came from China, India, and Sri Lanka, as you can see on this picture that I found when I started my fieldwork in 2007 in the Museum of Medical History at the University of Hong Kong. And this is the team that had just discovered the SARS-CoV-1 that had caused a very important health crisis in 2003. The Hong Kong Birdwatching Society, a group of British military officers counting birds while watching over the border with China, became an association promoting citizen science and the conservation of the 500 bird species flying over Hong Kong on their route from Japan to Indonesia. Hong Kong became a sentinel post for influenza pandemics, not only in the sense that global experts would detect early warning signals of pandemic viruses coming from China, but also in the sense that Hong Kong citizens conceive themselves as sentinels exposed to the accelerating threats of globalization and read in the movements of birds signs of their own fate. So this is a book that is published by Peter Doherty, who is the Nobel Prize for Immunology and who did his career in Australia. But as you can see from the title, Sentinel Chickens, What Birds Tell Us About Our Health and the World. Hong Kong farmers have developed biosecurity measures that implements this notion of sentinel as a soldier sending warning signals from the front line. Unvaccinated chickens are placed at the entrance of the farm where they detect new influenza viruses, a position analogical to the cannibal cows who watch over the rest of the herd in Levi-Strauss's technological utopia. And this is a picture in the middle that I took in a poultry farm where I worked in 2009. The experience of lockdown during COVID-19, when half the global population imitated a measure invented by an authoritarian regime to control an epidemic for which sentinels and whistleblowers had been repressed, has led us to forget that the experience of the SARS epidemic in 2003 promoted the democratic experience of the Hong Kong people. When the first SARS coronavirus appeared in Hong Kong, coming from baths through wet markets in South China, the Hong Kong government relied on these virologists to share the information about the virus in a transparent way, and the population complied to the sanitary measures by wearing masks to protect themselves from respiratory diseases. While the Beijing government managed epidemics relying on a vocabulary of war against an enemy and sacrifice of the frontline workers, the Hong Kong government turned the military concept of sentinel into a democratic potential for all citizens exposed to share early warning signals and mitigate the threat. So, in conclusion, we can return to Levi-Strauss and ask, how can we extend this democratic potential from the mobilization of sentinels by virus hunters to the rest of the society? So, as you understand, my claim is that the bird watchers of Hong Kong have extended the work of virus hunters when they go to poultry farms in China, and I suggest that we should continue this work of extension. Levi-Strauss is famous for his work on the kinship systems and mythologies of American societies. For Levi
and believing that wrong idea, that by aligning themselves with those wrong ideas, they would win support from those people? Or do you mean something quite different than that?
Thank you for the question, which I think is extremely important. It's a vital question for us. Why in the world are these people doing this? What are they selling? What is it getting them? And why would it seems, from within the academy, it seems it's just hard to understand what the motivation is. And if we can't figure that out, we can't counter it. Not that we can counter it anyway if we lose power. So, so what is the motive? And I said that in place of the disinformation campaigns that went on, we now know about that smoking doesn't cause cancer, and that global warming is not the result of fossil fuels, where there are profits at stake. People are trying to sell something. They didn't want people to think it was dangerous. They don't have to convince people that it's not dangerous. All they have to do is instill doubt that there's that scientists are virtually unanimous in saying that these are risky products. But COVID, I mean, no one's selling COVID. What the heck is is the motive there? So I said it was power. Now, I didn't have time to refine that claim, so that's what you're asking about. Who is it who's seeking power? Now, these people I invited into my class, these two very nice people, they weren't seeking power. So I said that they were misinformers, they aren't disinformers. And I thought, look, since they seem to have, they're perfectly reasonable, nice people, it shouldn't take long to straighten them out. And I found out that I had that completely wrong, so it's going to be much harder than I thought. But the really hard case would be the disinformers. Now, who are they? Well, some of them are the GRU in the Soviet Union. They're pumping out lies through the internet. In an attempt, it is said by people who hold these hypotheses, looking from various research groups at Stanford and at Harvard and Oxford and elsewhere, it's just an attempt to destabilize Western democracy. How do you do that? Well, you convince people that their fundamental liberties are being taken away for no good reason, that they're being forced to accept substances to be injected in their bodies that will kill them and are killing millions of people, not to protect them from anything important, but from a non-disease that's no worse than the common cold. What we've seen in the rise of anti-science in the United States, which it's been going on at an accelerating rate, is that, as I mentioned in the talk very briefly, that originally it did not have a political coloration. In fact, if I can share an amusing anecdote, there was an important book called The Panic Virus that came out a few years ago by the journalist Seth Mnookin, who is now the chief of science writing at science journalism at MIT. And he was looking at the hysteria about the vaccine that's given to small children to protect them from mumps and rubella and so on, measles. And there was a fear being spread that this is causing autism. Now, an article was published in The Lancet that claimed that this was actually happening. It was later withdrawn as unscientific, and any number of studies have been conducted that have, I'm told by my colleagues, that have proven beyond any doubt whatever that simply isn't true. So who was spreading this? Well, at the time, my colleague who wrote the book was talking to an official at the Centers for Disease Control. How do you figure out where to concentrate your energy in trying to convince people that these things are safe? And he said, well, we start with a map of the locations of Whole Foods grocery stores. Now, if you've spent time in America, you know Whole Foods was a chain of grocery stores that said, we sell healthy food. And they also offered all kinds of remedies that had very little scientific backing, but you know, they were the paragon of health foods. And the people who shopped at Whole Foods were generally left of center. These were the so-called crunchy granola people. You liked, you know, pure homemade products and so on. Generally voted Democratic. So he said, we look at the locations of the Whole Foods stores and we draw a circle, 75-mile perimeter around them, and that's where we find the anti-vaccine people. Okay, that was then, but that's not that. It quickly became untrue, and the insinuations about the plotting of these evil scientists and this flood of disinformation started coming almost exclusively from the right. It's not 100% anymore, but that's where it came from. And it had amazing effects, so that in many states in the United States, there are laws being introduced that sort of ban the use of vaccines that come from mRNA, which is one of the great advances in science. There's no evidence whatever that, according to my colleagues, that these are especially harmful. All vaccines have risk. Everything has a risk of some kind. But they're being treated as if they're, you know, uniquely dangerous. And political campaigns are being pursued, trying to use this to stir up votes on the part of angry constituents. And that's, you know, these are usually very conservative Republicans, and these positions are now almost the official position of the Republican Party. In Germany, the Querdenken movement, which presented itself as just independent thinkers, well, apparently had sources, very close connections with the AfD party, the far right, and so on. So we see this I was briefly a consultant to some hospitals in Romania, whose own doctors were telling their patients that the vaccines were killing them. Where was this coming from? Again, it turned out to be political sympathies with far-right candidates. You see a pattern there. Now, I'm not an expert on this, of course, but I'm just reporting the evident closeness of these anti-science positions on the one hand, and the destabilizing far-right political agenda, which is threatening us in the United States and elsewhere.
Thank you. We have, in fact, run over our allotted time. Perhaps have time for one more question, if anyone is interested. If not, then, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If someone else has a question, I don't want to preempt it, but...
oh, sorry.
You have a question?
Okay, fine.
Well, I just wanted to ask Frederic to clarify the relation between fellowship with animals and democracy. I mean, obvious, or not obviously, the kind of continuity across humans and other species is a good, it seems, whether it comes from something like compassion or something like a shared disease. But I don't quite grasp exactly what you're claiming about the relation of that to democracy, other than that both democracy and continuity with other species are good things.
Thank you for that question. Yes. Okay. So my argument is that we have thought democracy in Europe based on the Greek model of the separation between the agora and the silva. So all the relations we have with animals are located in the margins of the public space, and we discuss between humans in the agora. And for example, in 1996, we had a problem with an animal disease transmitted to humans. We killed the cows, and we started eating beef again. And Lévi-Strauss says, we have to look at what the Amazonians and the Melanesians do, because they're used to relating to animals by hunting techniques and shamanistic techniques of having drinks with animals before the hunt. So my argument is that we also can look at what the Chinese societies have done with animal diseases, as they do not rely on the separation between agora and silva or between culture and nature. They have a long tradition of compassion with animals in Buddhist religious practices. And I don't claim that all Chinese people have this empathy for animals. I look at the practices of various centers in Hong Kong that was part of the constitution of Hong Kong as a democratic territory, by contrast with the managing of animal diseases by the Beijing government, which was authoritarian, relied on killing animals, repressing whistleblowers. And so we come to the fact that the way Hong Kong people, the Hong Kong government and scientists managed the SARS-CoV-1 virus was democratic, whereas the way the Beijing government managed the SARS-CoV-2 virus was not democratic.
Very quick then. Okay, thank you both. I have the impression that there is something in common between your two speeches, which is about the relation of science to democracy, and that it's a problem of the way science is caught in power relations, in a way, the way it is. So my impression for the disinformation, misinformation question is also that, so you were saying then, they seek power and not money, but in a way, if we look, what is the problem? The problem is that science tells businesses that there is something problematic in what they do. And so Naomi Oreskes started analyzing that kind of things with this whole community. But in a way, the problem is the fact that government regulates business. I think really that's at the heart of the disinformation problem. There's something, and the fact that science or sciences or the scientific institutions is part of the argument that the governments use to regulate sciences. Therefore, sciences need to be challenged by business interest, basically. So I have the impression that that question is still at the core. And it goes with the problem of, yes, how the scientific discourse and scientific institutions are part of the democratic or of the political institutions. That's my impression. And that in the far-right agenda, the idea is to prevent scientific institutions from controlling or from restricting business liberties, and it goes very well with the libertarian agenda. So I have the impression that it aligns rather clearly, but maybe, and a little note also, what I find interesting here is also the problem of, since you need to analyze this information or misinformation, we need actually a kind of social science. We need social science to understand that. So we need more science, basically, to understand why people don't trust science. But thank you very much for your talks.
If I can just reply by clarifying my argument. So the distinction I made between pastoral power and synergetic power within Foucault's concept of biopolitics is a way to address these different relations between science and power. So pastoral power is the use of science to regulate business, as you say, by numbers. So science produces numbers, and business doesn't need numbers to work, but sometimes it does. And numbers can be used as promoting business and sometimes as controlling business. So as we saw with numbers of the effect of vaccination, or this fantastic dashboard of the number of casualties caused by the restriction of funds in USAID. These are numbers. We need social sciences to understand how these numbers are produced. But we also need to produce these numbers to act in a democratic way, rather than these numbers being used by business itself. So what I say about synergetic power is also a production of science to regulate business, but it's not a production of numbers, it's a production of signs and images. So various virologists produce signs, viral lines in data banks. They also produce images that the journalists take, like bats that transmit a virus from China to the rest of the world. But these signs and images, they can also be used in an anti-democratic way. I think the whole debate about social media that are used against the numbers of pastoral power is that they rely on signs and images a lot. So the problem is, how can we make the politics of signs and images more democratic and maybe also more scientific?
I think we should adjourn this session now. Please give our speakers a round of applause.
We are reconvening in around 15 minutes.
right. May I ask for your attention? Ladies and gentlemen. Okay, welcome for the second session of the Delphi Dialogues. My name is Patrice Maniglier. I had the privilege and the pleasure of being here last year for the previous Delphi Dialogues, and I now have the privilege of being one of the instructors for the seminars of the Delphi Academia, thanks to our dear friend and colleague, Professor Roylos, whom I want to thank again warmly. I have also the privilege of chairing this session and introducing two very distinguished scholars. And the first one who will speak is Elaine Scarry. So Elaine Scarry teaches at Harvard University, where she is the Walter M. Cabot Professor of Aesthetics and General Theory of Value, and a senior fellow at Harvard Society of Fellows. She lectures both nationally and internationally on nuclear war, law, literature, medicine, and has been a Guggenheim Fellow, as well as a Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin, at the Getty Museum Research Centers in Los Angeles, at the Stanford Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. She was elected to the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Science. She also awards honorary degrees from more than one universities. She also won recently the Zabel Award for the American Academy of Arts and Letters for a writer of progressive, original, and experimental tendencies. Her work has two central subjects, the nature of physical injury and the nature of human creation. Her writings include the very famous and classic now, The Body in Pain in 1985, On Beauty and Being Just in 1999, Dreaming by the Book in 1999, and more recently, Thermonuclear Monarchy in 2014. In 2005, Prospect Magazine and Foreign Policy named her one of the world's. Join me in welcoming Elaine Scarry, who is going to speak about thermonuclear monarchy. Can a single speech act destroy all civilization? Elaine, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, let me say it again, although I think you can intuit what I said, which is that, like everybody who's spoken so far, I'm immensely grateful to be included in this program and just moved beyond belief to be in Delphi. And as Patrice said, the title of my talk is Thermonuclear Monarchy, Can a Single Speech Act Destroy All Civilization? The worldwide nuclear architecture, consisting of 9 nuclear states and 12,000 warheads, has two key features. The first is the unthinkable scale of injury it is designed to bring about. Current research shows that if even a tiny percent of the worldwide arsenal is used, not 1%, but 0.04%, 20 million people will die on the first afternoon and 1 billion people will die in the first month. The International Red Cross has said that if even a single city is hit, its worldwide medical resources will not be able to help. This first feature, the unprecedented scale of the injury to human beings and all other living things, is widely recognized. It is why we call nuclear weapons weapons of mass destruction. It is not just that the 8.2 billion humans alive today that will be lost, but the collective human labor over thousands of years of inventing and transmitting civilization that will be gone. The second key feature is less widely recognized, but is equally obscene. While the level of injury involves the colossal magnification, the second feature, the site of initiation, entails a miniaturization, a contraction of scale. The launch is executed by a single person in all 9 of the nuclear states. In the United States, this is done by the President acting alone, requiring no second consultation or voice or vote from anyone in the cabinet, his military, his legislature, or his citizenry. The leader is accompanied 24/7 by the nuclear football. The launch order is the length of a tweet. In fact, as we know from former missile launch officer Bruce Blair, the launch order is actually half the length of a tweet. So at one end of the weapon, the injuring end, we have a huge magnification. At the other end, the end of authorization, there is a colossal miniaturization. At one end, as we know from scientific accounts of the making of the bomb, huge intellectual resources were used to develop a form of spectacular injury. At the other end, human intelligence is reduced to its smallest integer, a single person. The nuclear architecture thus combines the worst cruelties of intelligence and stupidity. The design of the initiating launch, the reliance on a sole actor, is not hypothetical. Of those nuclear nation states where we have records, we know that first use of a nuclear weapon, that is, the launch of a weapon not in response to an incoming missile, but as an originating event, was contemplated by American President Eisenhower in 1954 in the Taiwan Straits crisis, and again by President Eisenhower in the 1959 Berlin crisis. It was contemplated again by American President John F. Kennedy, whose Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, tells us that during the Kennedy administration, the country 3 times came within a hair's breadth of all-out nuclear war. American President Lyndon Johnson contemplated dropping a nuclear bomb on China in order to prevent China from acquiring a weapon. American President Richard Nixon, during his impeachment trial, said to a reporter, "I can go into the next room, pick up the phone, and in 20 minutes, 70 million people will be dead." He later acknowledged that he had 4 times contemplated delivering a nuclear weapon. By the word contemplated, we mean not a passing thought, but a concrete plan of action. In Nixon's case, for example, in October of 1969, he sent 18 B-52s loaded with nuclear weapons from Alaska towards Russia and Vietnam. The reason I'm not giving you more recent examples is this. Despite the requirement that a democratic government be transparent, presidential papers are usually sealed for 30 years. Nixon's 18 B-52 depravity became public knowledge in 2008. That's 39 years after the event. Thus, we have solitary leaders coming close to acts that will, at the very least, inflict scalding levels of injury to millions of foreign people, most of whom will evaporate immediately, acts that have every chance of triggering an all-out nuclear war, eliminating civilization, yet can only be thought about as a mere curiosity because one is hearing about the event long after the danger is past. I've given examples from the United States because that is the nuclear state where, by virtue of my own citizenship, I am complicit. It is also the country whose records are, though largely hidden, more accessible to me than are those of the other 8 nuclear states where it is more difficult to check sources. But certainly other nations have been subject to the same. French leader François Mitterrand has described a moment during the 1982 Falkland Island War, which took place between Argentina and the UK, when an Exocet missile, owned and fired by Argentina, but made by the French, hit and sunk the British destroyer HMS Sheffield, killing 20 on board. UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher sent the country's 4 nuclear submarines into the southern Atlantic Ocean and called the French president. Mitterrand reports, quote, "She threatens to launch the atomic weapon against Argentina unless I supply her with the secret codes that render deaf and blind the missiles we have sold to the Argentinians." The moral turpitude of a speech act that could very easily end thousands of years of civilization and kill 90% of all living creatures can perhaps be appreciated nowhere better than at Delphi, where the central acts are speech acts, and where those speech acts were holy and brought humans into relation with metaphysical powers, rather than plunging them into moral depravity and turpitude. And I'll just add that if you know anything about the Oracle, you know that she often spoke about constitutions, overseeing the entry into war, and emancipation, and those are topics that are going to come up in what I go on to speak about. A performative speech act, rather than describing an already existing world, brings about a material change in the world. For most of us, speech acts are normally undertaken only over our own individual lives. One speech act affects one person, and the person making the speech act is identical with the person affected. Two people can perform a reciprocating speech act, binding the two of them. A familiar example is the marriage vow, in which the simple act of verbal utterance, I do, brings about the reciprocal transfer of rights over the body and a material relation as profound as biological kinship is. A framing one-to-one ratio can also hold true where millions must ratify a constitution or a constitutional amendment that will in turn affect millions. The one-to-one ratio is maintained. Millions vote and millions are affected, and it is largely the same millions in the two groups. But there are also special speech acts where words spoken by a single individual bring about a material change in the lives of many people. If the material alteration is benign, if it's a good outcome, an improvement in the lives affected, then the fact that there is only a single speaker may be fine. It may even be greeted as nearly miraculous or godlike. A memorable example is the January 1, 1863 Speech Act carried out by United States President Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, in which a single spoken sentence profoundly changed the lives of 4 million African Americans. Quote, I, Abraham Lincoln, do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforward shall be, free. Even in this wholly magnificent solitary action, Lincoln, though bearing full solitary responsibility, had elaborately and steadily consulted with cabinet, military, and citizenry, and had announced 100 days in advance that he would speak that sentence on January 1, specifying the exact words he would say. Knowing the Emancipation Proclamation was forecast to take place on January 1, we can imagine the mounting anticipation and the guarded exhilaration of the watch parties that took place that New Year's Eve and the next day. Here's an example. Thomas Wentworth Higginson is somebody known to many of us who study literature as the correspondent, mentor, and friend of the American poet Emily Dickinson. And also, he was the first person to record and publish the words of the African American sorrow songs, songs that W.E.B. Du Bois later designated the only original source of artistic beauty thus far created in the United States. But Higginson, a political radical, was also the commander of the 1st Black Regiment in the Civil War and wrote a memoir, Army Life in a Black Regiment. In it, he describes the Sunday church service his regiment held on January 1, 1863, on an outside platform with hundreds gathered under live oak trees. Higginson hadn't expected anything portentous, since the men in the all-black South Carolina regiment, fighting on behalf of the North, already rightly regarded themselves as free. Yet Higginson confesses, quote, I never saw anything so electric. When, during the church service, Lincoln's words were read aloud, the spontaneous voice of a single black singer emerged, and then was quickly joined by hundreds of black men and women singing, My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. We can see that there are two key questions about speech acts. First, in what circumstances is it permissible for the number of persons performing the speech act to be smaller than the number who are affected by the speech act? To answer this, we need to move to the crucial second question, does the speech act injure or instead diminish the injury of the people it affects? There is a third, and that is to what extent does the Speech Act accommodate dissent, disagreement, and the alteration of, or redirection of the Speech Act? That is, to what extent has it received any testing? Historically, we can see the way civilizations have worked to ensure that if the Speech Act will bring about an injury rather than a life blessing, the number of people performing the Speech Act must be larger than the number of persons injured. This is clear in the arrangements across many centuries and in many countries for criminal prosecution. In the United Kingdom and in the United States, 12 people are required to deliver a unanimous guilty verdict of a single criminal before that person can be subject to the injury of imprisonment. The idea is that a greater number allows for deliberation, for statement of reasons, for a testing of asserted information. That testing by no means ensures, but certainly increases the chance that the verdict may be deserved. The procedure is designed to be cumbersome. It is designed to be an impediment to injury, an impediment to the guilty verdict. The arrangement for a double jury, a grand and a petite jury, was first introduced in England in the 14th century. Figures from the 17th century show that 44% of those accused of murder were exonerated using the double jury. 55% of those accused of infanticide were exonerated. The addition of other provisions such as legal counsel and rules of evidence later increased the breaking effect of this arrangement. Though I have taken the Anglo-American example of how in the case of criminal punishment, the number uttering the Speech Act, guilty or innocent, must exceed the number injured, many other cultures show the same arrangement. We may deplore the verdict against Socrates in 399 BCE, but it is at least to Athens' credit that 501 jurors were required to listen to the arguments and to render the verdict. The same principle is visible if we move further back to the most ancient of civilizations, 3rd millennium BCE Sumer, where the first record of a murder conviction shows 9 persons were required to determine the guilt, that is, to obtain the license to injure the accused person. Similar thinking across many centuries has structured a state or a kingdom's entry into war. Like the grand and petite juries that act as a filter on the executive ability to punish, so the legislative assembly acts as a brake on the executive's ability to initiate war. Throughout history, human communities have again and again decided that their king can enter war if and only if the legislative assembly provided a speech act licensing that act. It is not just that early parliaments held as one of their tasks the debate on the issues of going to war. It is instead the case that legislative assemblies first came into being precisely to stop kings from taking their nations to war without the population's consent. The first and fundamental reason assemblies were invented was to act as a braking power on the executive desire to go to war, or where the assemblies endorsed the proposal as an enabling power. Scholars such as J.R. Madicott, Gaines Post, and Thomas Bisson have shown that this was decisively true of England and Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries, and became more and more emphatic in the 13th century. The reigning principle was, and now I'm quoting, "That which touches all must be approved by all," or as it was formulated in Latin, "Quod omnes tangit ab omnibus approbator." We can go much further back in time. Thucydides records assemblies during the Peloponnesian War debating whether or not the people of Lacedaemon should regard Athens as an enemy, even permitting a traveling Athenian to speak to the question on the floor of the assembly. Or again, whether or not the entire male population of Mytilene should be executed for the city's betrayal of Athens. Thousands of years earlier, again, the record of 3rd millennium BCE Sumer shows that the creation of a bicameral legislature, one house composed of elders, the other of fighting men, what they debate in this record is whether to follow their leader Gilgamesh into war. Conceivably, it could have happened that this crucial legislative braking function would be so self-evident that it wouldn't have needed to be written down. Fortunately, the United States Constitution stipulates that the country cannot begin to injure a foreign population until Congress issues a declaration of war. The profound historical background of social contract practice and theory makes immediately intelligible why the country's leading jurist, Joseph Story, describes this short provision, 1811, the power of Congress to declare war, as the cornerstone of the Constitution. The requirement for a large body, and today that would be 535 people, debating and deliberating is not just a provision of the Constitution, it is at its heart what a social contract is. Without it, the Constitution decays and democracy, as we are seeing in the United States today, disappears. Had Provision 1811 been followed, it would not have been possible for the United States to acquire nuclear weapons, as Robert Oppenheimer recognized shortly after the completion of his work. Since the invention of nuclear weapons, the requirement for a declaration of war has been jettisoned, even when entering conventional wars like Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, former Yugoslavia, or when invading Panama, Grenada, and Haiti, none of which had a congressional declaration of war. This astonishing presidential appropriation of powers for acting outside our borders has a counterpart in increased presidential appropriation of power inside the borders. Executive action has each decade grown. Presidential executive orders proliferated so that by the 1970s, 470 statutes existed delegating power to the executive over virtually every aspect of American life, as legal scholar Jules Lobel points out, quoting a Senate report. Presidential power that has since then increased, appearing in presidential control of drug wars, civilian transportation, and civilian nuclear plants. The number continues to accelerate. According to the Federal Register, our current president in the United States has issued 161 executive orders just in the first half of 2025. Nuclear weapons and constitutions are mutually exclusive. If the courts were to review the constitutional provision, they will have to issue a declaratory judgment on the illegality of our weapons. At least 3 other nuclear states, France, India, and Russia, have constitutional provisions stipulating that the country cannot carry out an offensive war unless it has the parliament or legislature's authorization. That may mean that in those countries, as in the United States, a case can be brought to their courts to ask for a declaratory judgment on the way nuclear weapons violate the Constitution. The French Constitution has Article 35, which states, quote, "A declaration of war must be authorized by Parliament." France cannot make an amendment changing this important provision since the final clause of their Constitution, Article 89, reads, quote, "The Republican form of government is not the object of any amendment." And this legislative oversight of war is the very heart of Republican form of government. India's Article 246 stipulates that Parliament, quote, "has exclusive power to make laws for defense of India and every part thereof, including preparation for defense, for naval, military, and air forces, any other armed forces of the Union, for deployment of any armed force of the Union, or any other force subject to the control of the Union," and so forth, including the control of atomic energy. The Russian Constitution, Article 102, gives its legislature, the Federal Council, the equivalent of the US Senate, the power of deciding on the possibility, I'm quoting, "deciding on the possibility of using the armed forces of the Russian Federation outside the territory of the Russian Federation." As in non-nuclear Norway, the president of Russia can act up to the border to defend the country, but cannot step one step over that border unless and until the Assembly has authorized the action. The question posed by this paper's title is, can a single speech act destroy all civilization? The legal answer, the constitutional answer, the just answer, is certainly not. But the physical answer, right now and at every moment since 1945, is certainly yes. If we think of the medieval legal principle, quod omnes tangit, ab omnibus approbatur, that which touches all must be approved by all, we can see that in the most literal way possible, nuclear war is that which touches all. But far from being approved by all, it is only approved by a few solitary actors. John Locke says that the tyrant Caligula wished that all the people were joined together at the neck so he might dispatch them all at one blow. Nuclear weapons have made Caligula's wish come true. We can all be dispatched in a single blow. But we have also seen that at least 4 nuclear states have constitutional provisions that make sole authority and first use practices illegal. These constitutional provisions enable those populations and their parliaments to go to the courts and ask for a declaratory judgment on the unconstitutionality of nuclear architecture. These acts, in combination with the International Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, will provide pressure on governments to give up the nuclear architecture voluntarily. Ultimately, giving up sole authority is giving up the nuclear architecture, since nuclear weapons require a solitary actor. These constitutions therefore put the off switch in the hands of their citizens and their assemblies. But an off switch won't go off by itself. It requires us to reach out and push it down. I hope you will join me in helping to bring this about. Thank you.
Thank you for this very powerful talk. And I am now introducing Michael Hart. Michael Hart teaches political theory in the literature program at Duke University. His work combines philosophical investigation with analysis of our current political situation, studying the current forms of social domination, including the mechanisms of capitalist control, which form the basis of contemporary global power structures, is a central focus of his work. His first book was Gilles Deleuze, An Apprenticeship in Philosophy in 1993. Sorry, I couldn't help remembering that. Over the course of several decades, his collaborations with Antonio Negri resulted in 6 books which have been very formative for many of us. Labor of Dionysus in 1994, Empire in 2000, Multitude in 2004, Commonwealth in 2009, Declaration in 2012, and Assembly in 2017. His latest book, The Subversive 70s, that came out in 2023, analyzes liberation movements of the 70s in a wide range of countries throughout the world, highlighting their relevance for political struggles today. Since 2010, he served as editor of the South Atlantic Quarterly. Please join me in welcoming Michael Hart. Yeah, I forgot to say, but maybe it's here, that he's going to speak of democracy and the global war regime, which seems to have some connection with what we just heard.
In fact, it does. I'd like to thank the organizers and also recognize their prudence in putting us together, because I think the 2 lectures go very well, one after the other. I'm going to start with democracy and then arrive only briefly at the question of biopower as we go. As the practices and the logics of war have risen, as the practices and logics of war have recently risen in various national contexts and on the global political scene, correspondingly have declined the functioning of structures of democracy. That democracy is precluded or suspended in active war zones, such as Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Iran, that comes as no surprise. What I, along with several others, identify as an emerging global war regime, however, is not isolated as such war zones. This is a new paradigm that extends war logics and methods throughout the economic, social, and political landscapes of nations and regions nominally at peace. That's what I want to investigate, and it's there that I want to investigate the status of democracy. Economic decision-making in Europe, for instance, is increasingly driven by war logics. The dramatic reorientation toward arms and military expenditures of both national budgets and the European budgetary framework, the Rearm Europe plan as a prime manifestation, brings with it inevitably new austerity measures and dramatic cuts in social spending. Moreover, in Europe and elsewhere, militarization is deeply intertwined in ever new ways with capitalist reorganization and technological innovation. Some of the most advanced technological achievements have a prominent role in Gaza and Ukraine, including artificial intelligence, drone technologies, private satellites, and enhanced surveillance. Capitalist economies have long been wedded to arms production and military technologies, But in recent years, the relationship has become stricter and more direct. And clearly, the more that military budgets and military objectives determine economic decision-making, the less room there is for any form of democratic control or participation. Although new permutations of this link between war and the capitalist economies, such as Europe, are certainly important, my primary concern here is not the economic but the political face of the war regime. And for that question, the United States in the second Trump government is a great laboratory. The list of current and recent authoritarian leaders, of course, is long, including Putin, Modi, Bolsonaro, Milei, Bukele, Orbán, Duterte, Erdogan, and I could probably go on for a while. The Trump experience holds a special place, however, in part because of the power of the United States on the global scene, and also because of the tradition of the United States being held up as a beacon of democratic governance. And yet the Trump government is undermining and throwing into crisis structures that long have been reputed to be the bulwark of democracy on both national and global political terrains. Within the US, constitutional crisis or constitutional collapse, depending on how far one estimates the process has proceeded, is currently the focal point of legal scholars and commentators who analyze the attack on democracy. Trump's refusal to recognize the outcome of the 2020 presidential election and his role in the January 6, 2021 events at the US Capitol are obvious examples of his attacks on the constitutional order. Since his 2025 inauguration for a second term, however, the speed of the attacks has dramatically accelerated and the areas of constitutional law affected have expanded. I'm sure you're all well aware of the basic outlines of this anti-constitutional campaign: illegal firings of state employees, illegal deportations of people legally residing in the country, illegal cuts of funding designated by Congress for various institutions, including scientific research, attacks on the press, on the university, on personal adversaries of the president, and much more. During the blitzkrieg of the first months of 2025, it was common to hear indignant responses like, "They can't do that, it's against the law." But increasingly one hears instead expressions of resigned acceptance. Yes, it's against the law, and yes, of course, they certainly can do it. One can still hope, of course, that the US courts and ultimately the US Supreme Court will effectively combat these measures and thereby restore the rule of law and the constitutional order, or that the legislative branch or even the Republican Party will itself fulfill this role. The debate among constitutional law scholars whether the US is suffering a constitutional collapse or a constitutional crisis largely turns on whether these established political forces can and will act effectively, and thus whether we're witnessing a short-term deviation or a long-term trend. There's indeed much more to be said about the political situation in the United States, but my objective here is simply to enlist it as an example of the political face of what I'm calling the war regime. By war regime, I mean that political relations increasingly operate according to war logics. One could point to some explicit indications of the prominence of military power, such as the enormous military parade in Washington for June 14th last weekend, Trump's birthday, or more dramatically, the rapid and illegal deployment of the National Guard and the Marines to counter largely peaceful protests in Los Angeles in the last weeks. I'm primarily interested in a connection that is more abstract and more fundamental than these two examples. In the war regime, political relations are less oriented towards generating consent and more invested in the use of force, violence, intimidation, threats, and fear. I focus so much on the constitutional order and the rule of law because they are important elements that have in the past guaranteed consent, and thus undermining them can be read as a significant shift. Many ask whether fascism is the correct term to name the current situation in the United States and other countries under right-wing regimes. I find it more precise and more useful to evaluate current power relations in terms of the proportions of consent and force, simply recognizing a marked shift from the former to the latter, as I said. From this perspective, hegemony, which I understand to require the predominance of consent over force, may no longer be the operative and appropriate concept. Instead, political relations should be understood, as I said, in terms of a war regime. Here's another approach to the same idea. Karl von Clausewitz famously remarked in the 19th century that war is a continuation of politics by other means, by which he meant a continuation of diplomacy or foreign policy. Several French philosophers, including Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, and Félix Guattari, adapted Clausewitz's formula in the 1970s and inverted it. They said politics is the continuation of war by other means. I think they were trying to make a point similar to mine here, but in my view, the formulation doesn't work because of the by other means clause. The means are crucial. It's one thing to say military actions and political campaigns have the same objective, although the former employs primarily violence and force, whereas the latter relies more strongly or even predominantly on mediation and consent. My argument here instead, and I think this is what those French philosophers had in their minds in the 1970s, is that we're increasingly faced with a situation in which politics is a continuation of war by the same means. I'm not primarily focused on the deployment of the military or on domestic soil or the militarization of the police, the imprisonment of or assassination of political enemies or similar developments. There are indeed clear examples of all that, what I just mentioned, and it's important to oppose them. My focus instead, as I said, is at a more abstract conceptual level, namely on the predominance of force over consent in power relations. The political face of the rising war regime is perhaps more clearly recognized on the terrain of international relations than on that of domestic politics. It's evident, for instance, in the dramatic return of a generalized political imaginary of territorial conquest and annexation as central determinants of international relations. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and still when it initiated its full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Putin's brutal project of territorial expansion seemed an anomaly to established international norms, and thus appeared to be an exception that could be contained. There were strong echoes of the international order of the early 20th century, an image reinforced by the mud of trench warfare in Central Europe. Israel's military operations, aimed at territorial conquest, not only in Gaza and the West Bank, but also Syria, southern Lebanon, perhaps beyond, might also have been viewed as an exception. Today, however, such anomalies are proliferating, such that one must question whether we're experiencing a paradigm shift. Such annexationist military operations dovetail with Trump's various threats in the early months of this year to annex Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal, and even Gaza. Suddenly it appears as though the paradigm of territorial annexation has been normalized, or at least consolidated. One can certainly, remaining within the US tradition, link Trump's projects or fantasies of territorial annexation to the long-standing myth of manifest destiny, that is, a quasi-divinely legitimated right or duty of the United States to limitless national expansion. But it's more appropriate to situate this as part of a larger contemporary phenomenon. The world map is once again in flux, and territory seems to be available for the taking by the most powerful. I view this as another face of the general transformation of power relations toward rule less by consent and more by force. Changes in US foreign policy provide ample evidence. First, as a point of contrast, in general terms, one can characterize a primary objective of the Biden government, before Trump, as a return to normal of US global hegemony. The US could regain institutions that generate limited but nonetheless significant levels of consent, that is, soft power. This was the general formula of US global hegemony roughly from the middle of the 20th century to the early portion of the 21st. In fact, I would say that the use of NATO to subordinate Europe by the Biden administration was one of those attempts of a reassertion of a US global hegemony. The Trump government, in its second term, has abandoned this formula in dramatic fashion. The correct term for this new direction is not isolation. It's rather a project to assert global dominance without hegemony, that is, relying on a greater proportion of force and less consent in parallel with its domestic strategy. Most remarkable has been the way that the US government in the last 6 months has undermined or completely abandoned so many of the institutions, its mechanisms of soft power, that had previously generated measures of consent on the international scene. USAID, along with other aid programs, the Voice of America, along with its allied US-inflected news and information programs, are obvious examples. The US is also withdrawing its guarantees of military security to allies and lowering the participation in and dedication to NATO. Similarly, US support for the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, the various allied institutions has declined notably, and has correspondingly US support for as has the US support for international law. Gone too is the pretense of defending democracy, championing human rights, and protecting freedom, all of which had been important ideological pillars of the US hegemonic order. Let me add one more example, parenthetically, I suppose, of US soft power that is being undermined. The US university. There is much to say about the ferocious and multi-pronged government offensive against universities in the US. And I'd be very interested in discussing this later, but much later, I suppose. But anyway, but my argument here is just that I want to note that for at least the last 75 years, students from other countries attending US universities have been a powerful level in generating consent for US global hegemony. Elites of countries throughout the world have sent their children to the US to study, and as a result, the economics minister of Ecuador or Egypt, for example, is likely to have attended business school at Harvard or Yale. But this is not solely an elite phenomenon, and it has long generated material, cultural, and ideological attachments to the US as a form of soft power, is what I wanted to say. All the examples I cited of the decline of soft power signify, in my view, the abandonment of the mechanisms and practices of US global hegemony. Said another way, in parallel to the political developments undermining democracy in various national contexts, the democracy of the global system, such as it was, consent to US hegemony, and on various institutions with the power to mediate disputes and conflicts. This is eminently apparent in the current drama of trade and tariff wars. Negotiation and diplomacy, let alone arbitration by a relatively neutral supranational institution such as the WTO, has given way to force, threats, and attempts at blackmail. Parenthetically, it's worth asking at this point, that had served for decades as pillars to support US global hegemony, why abandon effective mechanisms of power? Soft power is, nonetheless, a very real form of power. My hypothesis, but this is just a conjecture at this point, is that the Trump team recognizes correctly that US hegemony had already declined to such a significant degree that its mechanisms of soft power had largely been hollowed out. From this perspective, the Biden government's hope to resuscitate US hegemony was a futile last gasp of a dying strategy. If indeed the possibility of returning to hegemony is excluded, and if the privileged global position of the US is to be maintained, then it is not really a choice. The only weapons that remain effective involve the deployment of force and violence, intimidation and fear. But to verify this hypothesis would require much more analysis and argument. Let me simply return to my general point in this section of the argument. The decline of global hegemony is matched by the rise of attempts at global and regional dominance. And corresponding with my previous point regarding recent developments in domestic politics undermining democracy, particularly in the US, the form of democracy that was previously conceived as part of the liberal global order has significantly declined. One more parenthesis before moving on. In the war regime that I'm attempting to analyze here, it seems to me that biopower and its attendant strategies have little place, or have less place, let's say. Biopower and discipline, different though they are, both function primarily through consent. They produce not only docile bodies and minds, but also subjects that themselves further the strategies of power, whether through prison routines or health regimes. Violence, threats, and fear do figure as elements of discipline and biopower, of course, but they're not the major weapons. Insofar as force takes center stage, today's emerging war regime corresponds perhaps in some sense, or apparently, to a regime of sovereignty, which Foucault poses as a foil for both discipline and biopower. I personally don't think it's useful, however, to read our current situation as a return to the past with concepts such as sovereignty. We would likely have to invent new concepts for this situation. I know I'm opening a large question here, the one about biopower and this war regime. I simply want to situate my argument with respect to biopower to open some possible lines of discussion. Good. One common response that, in my view, is excluded is the one that seeks to oppose the anti-democratic developments of the war regime, both within national political spheres and on the global scene, by returning to normal, and thus defending the institutions that ruled previously. Not only is such a return not feasible, but also the normal that is sought is itself a problem. Those supposedly democratic institutions and political structures provided a poor version of democracy. When criticizing the many ways in which Trump himself is undermining the US Constitution, for instance, one should keep in mind that the primary structures of that Constitution are themselves anti-democratic and designed to prevent equal representation. These include the distorting effects of the Electoral College in presidential elections, the Senate's overrepresentation of those in the least populous states, the lifetime appointment of judges, the widespread gerrymandering, like false anti-representative organization of electoral districts, and the extraordinarily high hurdles to amending the Constitution itself. These constitutive and undemocratic features fit hand in glove with the long history of racial subordination in the United States, which continues to function in part by granting electoral power to rural areas with predominantly white populations at the expense of urban centers with large black and brown constituencies. This phenomenon is even more obvious on the international terrain, where many of the institutions of US soft power that are now being jettisoned, in fact, contribute, and perhaps in the past contributed some sense of democracy, were in fact not democratic at all. All this means to me that in order to combat the global war regime, we need to invent a new concept and new practices of democracy. This, of course, is a very large task. Let me conclude by simply pointing to two existing political areas in which we can draw. There are 9 seconds. I'll just go with, okay. Just two very rough ideas about what I mean by rethinking democracy, or where the resources for such could be. Okay. One of those resources involves the innovations of the social movements that have long criticized as the undemocratic nature of the ruling powers and have experimented with new participatory democratic practices. The slogan of the encampments in Spain in 2011, for instance, Democracia Real Ya, real democracy now, that slogan was not only indicative of the rejection of what was presented as democratic, but also a demand for a new, more authentic democracy. The entire cycle of struggles from 2011 to 2013, including the Syntagma Square occupation, the occupations in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Gezi Park in Turkey in 2013, all of them involved the creative participation, the creation of participatory decision-making structures and assembly forms. For the past 50 years, social movements have demanded democratic organizational forms, refusing vertical vanguard leadership, and have instead, and insisted on combating simultaneously multiple structures of domination: capital, patriarchy, racial hierarchy, and more. It's true that many of these movements have had serious problems, and all of them, one might say, have been defeated. But they do provide us with two democratic principles: participatory decision-making and multiplicity, by which I mean attacking simultaneously multiple structures of domination. Those two can serve as guides. A second axis is the tradition of internationalism in its various forms, which is not only an antidote to the national chauvinisms that fuel many aspects of the war regime, but can also create circuits of political innovation. Today, internationalism too needs to be reinvented. We cannot repeat the internationalisms of, for instance, Bandung in 1955 with the great men presiding, Sukarno, Nehru, Zhou Enlai, or the Havana Conference in 1955 with Fidel, Allende, and Cabral. Today, internationalism will probably have to function at different levels. A regional internationalism could be imagined, for instance, among Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil, and at the same time, the bases to construct internationalist connections among movements already exists. For instance, between the Woman Life Freedom movement in Iran and the Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina, both of which set out from protests against femicide, against the assassination of women, and gender violence to include a wide range of struggles for liberation. I know these final gestures regarding democratic resources are much too brief, but I simply want to indicate that in order to combat the war regime today, we do not need to take a defensive posture to defend what used to pass as democracy. Another option is available. Although more radical, I think it is in fact more realistic to work toward a democracy to come. One final word on the global war regime. We don't need Machiavelli to remind us that rule by force is much less stable. It's more fragile than rule by consent. It's hardly comforting to know, however, that in the long term, these emerging forms of dominance led by Trump, Netanyahu, and others will likely collapse, in part because they will do so much damage in the meantime. That's why it's no comfort, because even when they collapse, they will cause so much damage. We have to plan and act instead in the present to counter what's going on now and to construct an alternative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, war and democracy. In both talks, that was the question. We have, let's say, what, 10 minutes? 10 minutes? Exactly. That is what I'm going to say. There is a round table tomorrow, so if there is.
Elaine, thank you for that very stirring talk. Let me pose the challenge that I'm sure that you've heard many times. It'd be the natural first one. I just want to know your response, which is that in the terrible logic of the nuclear strategy, if one of the two major powers required the legislature to authorize the use of nuclear weapons before they could be used, they would make themselves vulnerable to a surprise attack from the other side, which could completely disable them within minutes, while the legislature is first getting the phone call saying we'd come in for a vote. And that's intolerable, which is why the president has to be given the football and why he must be allowed to act within just a few minutes, because after that it's all over. So, yeah.
To turn this over,
Yeah.
So there's no way that the Congress can handle nuclear weapons. In going to taking the issue to a court, we would be asking the court to give a declaratory judgment on the illegality and not saying, look, this destroys the whole nuclear architecture. But that's what it would do, in part, I mean, for many reasons, but in part because it's not as though Congress can launch a nuclear weapon for just the reason you said. They would, how can they deliberate? How can they vote? You know, while making it clear they're going to launch and therefore inviting a preemptive attack by the other side. But that doesn't mean that the commander-in-chief, the president, should have it. That just means that there is no way to have nuclear weapons except by this truly preposterous arrangement where you have one person who is licensed to blow up the world. You know, when you think of the way in which enemies talk about one another in nuclear war games, you often hear them talking about decapitation. Get rid of the leader and then you win. Well, in a way, that's another way of saying what I'm now saying in a very peaceful way. Not with any weapons do I think we need to decapitate it, but by using our laws, we need to decapitate it, because when you do so, you take down the whole nuclear architecture. Because there is no nuclear architecture. Nuclear weapons are first-use sole authority weapons. People talk as though what would be terrible is for a terrorist to get one, or for a hacker to get one, or for a teenager to get one. What's the difference? What could possibly make it better to have, you know, a nominal president or prime minister do it than to have a hacker or a terrorist do it? And by the way, the only reason they can get hold of it is because we've set up this incredible architecture that lets a hacker, you know, walk in there and do it. And in fact, there have been incidents where hackers put their logo on, like the atomic energy in India and so forth. You know, Carter accidentally sent the presidential codes that licensed him to give the launch order to the cleaners in his jacket pocket. Clinton lost the codes for several months and was too embarrassed to tell his military attaché that he didn't know where they were. But you know, is it somehow different to lose Delphi, to lose Athens, to lose, you know, all the great structures of the world because somebody who runs a cleaning agency did it, or than if a president did it? What's the difference? There really isn't any difference. So I think you're absolutely right. Congress can't handle nuclear weapons. And had we on day one said, there's no way these weapons can be made compatible with the Constitution, that should have been it, that you just can't have them. And that's what we know that lots of scientists tried to do in the immediate aftermath, was to say, you've got to rule these out right now, because they're you know, as the Oppenheimer film ends, the chain reaction may already right now be underway.
Thank you very much for this brilliant, both of you were brilliant. I have two questions, two remarks. Well, of course, the question of the hacker is an absolutely nightmare, you see, that who is going to control such a thing? Nobody. On the other hand, my question is the following. We had the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty with 191 countries as members. And it has worked somehow all these years as a threat because of the respect. We had 9, now we have 10 well-known nuclear powers in the world. And there was a certain reserve in an aggressive expression, let's call it like that, till now. My question is, don't you think that how are we going to restructure the way Professor Hart put it, to have a new international multilateral system? Because that, I see, it's totally discredited today. And the new administration, I mean, as you also mentioned it, does its best in that direction. Discreditation. My second remark is the following. Do we have a very disappointing evolution in our societies today or not? You were talking about the United States. But if I take the example of the European Union, I remember very well 25 years ago when Haider has been elected in Austria, immediately the European Union put into force Article 7, and Austria has been excluded and had no more right to vote. The same phenomenon happened 20 years later with Orban, and almost nothing happened. I think it's a kind of societal evolution there that makes me rather sad. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that I'm sure that the Non-Proliferation Treaty hasn't worked, because we, instead of having 1, 2, 3, 9, and as you're saying 10. Are you counting Iran or?
I assume we're counting Israel.
Yeah, Israel, but Israel's included in the 9.
Sorry?
Israel is included in the 9. Yeah.
No, Israel is included in the 9. Pakistan is included in the 9.
Yeah. India
is included in the 9, except France, Great Britain, the United States, Russia, China, and the last one.
Iran?
Is Belarus.
Oh, Belarus. Okay. Okay. Now I understand. Okay. But the other, so we can debate. Shown how many contradictions there are in that policy, one of which is if you keep saying that that's the way to protect your country, every country will want it. They'll drink the Kool-Aid. But the other reason the Non-Proliferation Treaty hasn't worked is that has as one of its 3 major pillars that the nuclear states have to disarm. That's what the and they haven't taken one step towards disarming. So I don't think that the Non-Proliferation Treaty has worked.
It has worked somehow in naming and shaming to a certain extent.
Yeah. And I think that when it works, I think that the United States, among its weaknesses, is that it is less good at symmetrical thinking than any other country on earth. And I think that the European Union, the countries there, can think symmetrically. What does this look like from the outside? And the United States, with over 800 military bases, talking about, China and Russia being aggressors when, China has between 0 and 4 foreign military bases. And on the question of the evolution, by which I think you mean the hardening of the heart, the fact that we aren't responding.
But the second question, higher, it's when the extreme right won the elections in Germany, in Austria, and they made a coalition. So the extreme right was the Austrian government at the time.
Yeah.
That provoked the exclusion of Austria.
Yeah.
I mean, the exclusion from the council.
Yeah.
And had no vote anymore. What 20 years later happens in Hungary doesn't have the same reaction at all.
Yeah.
I think that the evolution, as you mentioned, is a negative one in our societies, because we are responsible too.
I agree, and I think part of the problem is that the new generation, in my generation, people had experienced their own agency. They had fought in Korea, they had fought in Vietnam, or they had refused to, but they had a sense that what your country does depends on what you think. It's not that you go and turn on the television and find out what your country is doing. That's your responsibility to know it. And with having taken away military rights from new generations, it makes it harder for people to understand that this was their responsibility to oversee this, to make sure no foreign people get injured unless there's incredibly persuasive reason. Did you want to add something, Michael?
Thank you. Maybe we can leave the last word to Michael, since it's about, you've been invoked as...
Okay, but I'll be super quick, because then you should ask, because I just wanted to say that the trend you're pointing towards is exactly my point about, I don't think Trump in the U.S. is an anomaly. I mean, that it's weird. But I think if one were to do a similar analysis about Europe, it's definitely true, especially with regarding the rearmament and the translation. But what you're pointing to in political terms, I think in Europe too, there is emerging what I'm calling a war regime, like a tendency for political decision-making and economic decision-making to be based on military logics. Maybe James, you're going to say something.
Yes, I was directing to you a request in the spirit of my own bias of thinking that, in fact, governmentality remains very, very plural in the present of many different forms. Why we should not think of what is unfolding in the way of sending the National Guard in to cow the demonstrators complaining about immigration policies as precisely a matter of consent. That is to say, as de Tocqueville pointed out quite some time ago, this country has always had a tendency toward the tyranny of the majority. Majority of the electorate did, in fact, elect Trump. Oh, I'm sorry. Did, in fact, elect Trump, and my suspicion is that that majority continues to approve of exactly the policies he has been carrying out, not least of which, and here I grant you the lucidity of your formulation, his muscularity, if you will, as executive. So again, are we indeed facing a new paradigm, a paradigm shift, or just seeing the winds shifting in one or another direction, but not, in fact, the weather pattern being altogether novel?
No, it's an excellent question. I mean, one could also imagine that, no, but see, I wouldn't say this. I was going to say something I don't believe. I'll say it anyway. I don't believe what I'm about to say, which is that one could imagine that after 4 years that the U.S. would go back to normal. But so one thing I do want to argue is that normal was itself a problem. And also it seems to me unlikely but you're right, when we're talking about paradigm shifts, one has to talk about the accumulation of anomalies and if they've passed a certain point. So that's the way that's the kind of whatever big claim I'm entered into with this. And you're right.
So are we in the midst of a Kuhnian political revolution? Thank you very much. May I just suggest to the people here to watch, if you have never done that, the film by Peter Watkins called The War Game, which is about nuclear war. And I think this would be a very good introduction to the question of democracy and life. But thank you very much.